In this video, I will be discussing and performing a piece in C major by Jean-Henri d'Anglebert that, depending on which manuscript you are consulting, it is either a Gaillarde or a Sarabande in the form of a Gaillarde. Let me briefly recount how I got to know this piece, and then I will talk about the title discrepancy as well as the significant differences between the two manuscript sources. A couple of months ago, I went to IMSLP to look for d'Anglebert's original 1689 edition of the Pièce de Clavecin and saw a listing for a piece I had not heard of before, a Sarabande en forme de Gaillarde in C major. The editor gave as his source the Bauyn manuscript, and I have talked in more detail about this manuscript in previous videos, but very briefly, this is a very important French source of 17th century harpsichord repertory. It is primarily known as one of the two main manuscripts that preserve the music of Louis Couperin, but it also contains music of other, mainly French composers. The main reason I didn't know this particular Sarabande before was because it's not included in d'Anglebert's Pièce de Clavecin of 1689. Needless to say, I was very excited to discover it and immediately started studying it. After I had played through it a few times, I made a preliminary recording and posted it on Facebook, whereupon a friend of mine informed me that this piece was also preserved in a second manuscript, widely considered to be a d'Anglebert autograph, and in that manuscript it appears in a more ornamented version and is also followed by a double, in other words a variation, which is even more heavily ornamented. At that point, I thought it would be fascinating to make a video performing and comparing the two manuscript versions. So what I decided to do was to first properly learn and then record the version in the Bauyn manuscript, since I already had the score, then wait a couple of weeks so that I could kind of forget that version as well as the embellishments I had added in the repeats, and then study the other version, hopefully with a somewhat fresh perspective. So after making both audio and video recordings of the Bauyn version in early August, and I'll post a link to the video I posted shortly afterwards, I started looking at the second version in September. Since the manuscript, incidentally, is attributed to d'Anglebert, I will refer to it as the d'Anglebert version from now on. A few remarks concerning this d'Anglebert manuscript. First of all, it now belongs to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, just like the Bauyn. It contains a total of 48 pieces, 20 of which are by d'Anglebert. Of these 20, 13 appear in d'Anglebert's 1689 publication of Pièce de Clavecin, while the remaining 7 are unpublished. One possibility is that these 7 pieces could have been intended for a second volume of Pièce de Clavecin. While technically speaking we do not know the copyist of the manuscript, the general consensus is that it is d'Anglebert himself, especially since he is using the same elaborate system of indicating ornaments that we find in d'Anglebert's Pièce de Clavecin of 1689. The d'Anglebert manuscript is available on IMSLP, and when I first took a look at that Sarabande, I was surprised to see that, in contrast to the Bauyn version, it is actually called a Gaillarde. Of course, the biggest surprise came when I decided to check the Bauyn manuscript, something which, in my enthusiasm to play and even share this piece on YouTube, I had neglected to do, because even there, the title was slightly different than what I thought it was. Let's look at the title as it appears in Bauyn. The first noteworthy detail is that the piece is not called just a Sarabande, but rather a Sarabande grave. The second detail is that, at least to me, it looks as if the scribe tried to cross out the word Gaillarde. Perhaps someone with more expertise has a different view, and if so, please let me know in the comments. From what I can tell, I don't think it is ink that has bled through the other side of the page, and you do find such cross-outs in other pieces within the manuscript. However, we should keep in mind that we are only looking at an online copy rather than the actual manuscript. At any rate, the other modern edition of this piece I consulted afterwards, namely the one by Kenneth Gilbert, lists the title as Sarabande grave en forme de Gaillarde. But I think the important lesson here is that if somehow you have access to the original source for a piece, whether it's a manuscript or a first edition, make sure you consult it, even if you end up not playing from it. Let's look now at the differences between the two versions. I've already mentioned the two most obvious ones, namely that in the D'Anglebert manuscript the piece is more heavily ornamented, and it is also followed by double, which is even more ornamented. There's also a slight formal difference. The Bauyn version has a petite reprise, that is, after the second section is repeated, the last few measures are played for a third time. It is important to mention, though, that in this particular case, the petite reprise is actually written out with extra ornamentation and more elaborate passage work, which, interestingly enough, resembles these measures as they appear in the double of the D'Anglebert manuscript. As I mentioned before, one of my strategies in approaching these two versions was to learn and record the Bauyn version without consulting the D'Anglebert version, because I did not want the D'Anglebert version to influence my interpretive decisions, especially when it came to ornamentation. Having gone through this process of learning the two different versions semi-independently, I have a few observations I would like to share with you. First of all, the D'Anglebert version is not just more ornamented, but in some cases the harmonic content has also been slightly filled in. From our modern vantage point, we may consider the D'Anglebert version as a more complete or a richer one. On the other hand, though, we could look at the D'Anglebert version as one in which the performer's interpretive input has been minimized. Indeed, when I was playing the Bauyn version, I found that I was encouraged to be a little more creative with the notation, because there was a lot more space that was left empty, and I had to use my imagination in order to decorate it. In the D'Anglebert version, most of the space had already been populated, so there weren't as many opportunities for adding extra stuff. The second observation concerns the various ornaments and embellishments I added in the Bauyn version. It was encouraging to discover that some of them ended up being similar to the ones in the D'Anglebert version. Of course, I'm not trying to claim anything along the lines of what I did is what D'Anglebert would have done. As I have mentioned in previous videos, the impetus behind historically informed performance, at least the way I see it, is to try to understand the performing conventions of previous eras as best we can, being fully aware that there are always going to be certain aspects that elude us. When I add ornaments and other embellishments in any Baroque piece, I always wonder whether what I'm doing has any relation to what performers would have done back then, and seen some similarities between my ideas and the Danglebert manuscript, at least lets me know that I'm not completely off. The next observation concerns the use of notes inégales. As a general remark, it is important to keep in mind that when it comes to the concept of notes inégales, we know that it was certainly a performing convention in France, but we do not know exactly how it was applied, or sometimes even when it was applied. This is because the historical sources that describe the practice refrain from providing specific rules or instructions, instead appealing to a performer's good taste for the proper use of inégalité. Incidentally, my suspicion for this lack of clarity is that it may have been too fluid and flexible of a concept to be precisely described or notated. All of this means that our own use of inégalité will necessarily involve our own personal and subjective choices. Now, what I found interesting in this particular piece was that I have a different feel about how to use notes inégales in the two different versions. Keep in mind that, as you will see when you follow the score along with the recording, this piece is notated so that the unit of the beat is the half note. In general, I think this piece calls for a more selective approach to inégalité. But while playing the Bauyn version, I found that I was inclined to apply inégalité at the level of the quarter note and treat eighth note gestures in various rhythmically flexible ways depending on the particular gesture, while in the Danglebert version, and especially in the double, I was more inclined to apply inégalité at the level of the eighth note. The last observation concerns more specifically the Danglebert version and its more elaborate and varied ornamentation. I would say that probably the most challenging performing aspect here is the occasional presence of two very different ornaments occurring simultaneously in both hands. In some respects, having such an elaborate network of ornaments definitely encourages dislocation, which means playing with the two hands not being synchronized or not being aligned. I think the challenge when performing the Danglebert version is to allow every ornament to speak independently of whatever else is happening at the same time, meaning that the two hands have to be operating quite independently of each other without at the same time losing sight of a recognizable rhythmic pulse. Let me show you a very brief example where such a simultaneous presence of two different ornaments occurs, because it happens at the very beginning of both the Gaillarde itself and of course the corresponding measure in the double. So let me start the Gaillarde and I will stop at that spot where we get two ornaments simultaneously. And it's right here where in the left hand I have to do, and the right hand. So what I'm trying to do is kind of keep them independent and not try to align them with each other. Interestingly enough, in the double, we get a different ornament in that spot in the right hand. So before I had this one, in the double I have this. So the corresponding passage sounds like this. And again, I'm trying to keep those two independent of each other. One final remark. The scores that accompany the performance are the original manuscript sources. As always, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoy the performances.